In 1952, the government commissioned a 9-minute film called Duck and Cover that shows Bert the turtle here pulling into his shell to survive a nuclear explosion. This film was widely distributed to United States school children in the 1950s. The film makes it clear that older people will try to help, but when the bomb goes off, you must be able to survive on your own. So the key to survival is to constantly remain alert and ready. Students practiced bomb drills, but also participated in citywide nuclear attack drills, involving tens of thousands of residents practicing clearing hundreds of city blocks. The National Interstate and Defense Highways Act of 1956 had created these massive highways with the intention of providing people in the cities and suburbs an easier escape from a nuclear weapon. Many children were given metal dog tags so they could be readily identified by their parents after a nuclear explosion. These kids learned to fear the loss of a future they could grow into and inhabit. They wondered if they might be the last children on Earth. These children were paying the price for the power that scientists had unlocked after fighting 2 world wars. Although the recent romanticists had placed their emphasis on science being in harmony with nature and about exploration, the spirit of science had found itself a new role: America's weapon against tyranny and the means to win the war in Europe. Stateside, American defensiveness bordered on hysteria. Americans knew exactly what a nuclear weapon was capable of. They'd done it. They'd sacrificed and died and put off love, careers, and having children in order to beat back Hitler's authoritarian threat. Suddenly, it had come back in a totally new way. The possibility of sudden nuclear annihilation at the hands of communists became part of everyday life. The very notion that trauma of unending fear and the need for hypervigilance, that it could have psychological or neurological impacts on the developing baby boomer generation, that didn't occur to psychologists until the social erosion of the 1960s and 1970s, which were becoming more apparent. Betrayal, cynicism, absurdity, and a profound distrust of authority were the overriding themes not only in the books of such popular writers as Ken Kesey and Kurt Vonnegut, but also in results from studies and commentary on issues at the time. Interviews and research conducted around the world during the late 1970s by individuals consistently found that nuclear-age youth were, in quote, profoundly disillusioned. And this, end quote, harmed their capacity to plan for the future. In many people, and especially in the developing brain, constant stress of the amygdala can rewire the brain to produce long-term negative effects that lead to PTSD. Studies showed that baby boomers, previously atomic-age children, had increased mental health problems that diverged sharply from the generations before and after, in many ways fitting this PTSD profile. So it's important to mention that there's definitely not enough data to say that the threat of imminent nuclear annihilation and the resulting hypervigilance and learned helplessness are wholly responsible for any particular social or epidemiological characteristics of the boomer culture. However, historical records suggest it was a significant contributing factor. We can see that during the 60s, drug and alcohol use ran at rates far higher than any previous generation, as did the adolescent suicide rate. Still to this day, suicide rates among baby boomers continue to run as much as 30% higher than other age cohorts. And divorce rates in 2010 among those aged 50 and older ran at twice the rate of the prior generation measured in 1990, while the US overall divorce rate had fallen 20% during the same time. How can we understand the relationship between the baby boomer generation and science today? Traumatized by a dozen years of high alert threat of nuclear holocaust, the public's patience was wearing thin. The enormously powerful nuclear bombs had made duck and cover a ludicrous claim. The government was failing the public in other ways too. The stated ideals of democracy that all men are created equal rang hollow before the fact of Negro life in the South and the big cities in the North. It didn't extend to other minority groups, or during the war to the Japanese, who had been held in American concentration camps. In our last video, discussed how the military-industrial complex seemed to be increasingly captivating public policy for its own profiteering ends. Scientists and engineers as a whole were suddenly seen as associated with this military-industrial complex, as were organized religion and other sources of authority, all of which had failed the young generation. All of this combined to increase the cynicism, rebellion, mistrust, and anti-government sentiment that had fueled the baby boomers' late adolescence and early 20s, giving rise to a new counterculture. Adults and governments had lost their moral authority. Hedonism was justifiable, since death might come at any moment. And America's youth felt trapped, like Jack Nicholson in The Cuckoo's Nest, of insanity in which it was the authorities and caretakers who were the brutal and insane ones. The baby boomers found their generational power by questioning the authority of the government and, by extension, government science. Instead of the solution, the government was seen as the problem, as Ronald Reagan would point out 2 decades later.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
The culture at large was beginning to reject science and tradition and the government itself. Faced with the collapse of mainstream culture's moral authority, but lacking the will to change it, many baby boomers either raged in anarchistic riots or tuned in, turned on, and dropped out. They adopted protest songs of folk music. Singer-songwriter Bob Dylan was a poet to a generation. Satire became a dominant cultural art form, with content like The Graduate, Catch-22, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Mad Magazine, Dr. Strangelove, Saturday Night Live, and many other satirical outlets which emphasized the absurdity of the times. The hilarious, humanitarian, anti-scientific Kurt Vonnegut gave a famous line at a college commencement speech that, "We would be a lot safer if the government would take its money out of science and put it into astrology and the reading of palms. I used to think science would save us, but only in superstition there is hope." Today, we explored the hurt relationship between the baby boomer generation and science. By observing their situation, we can empathize and hopefully begin coming to terms with a new vision of science for the world. One based on visibility, civil participation, and care. Our next video will reflect on the value of visibility to the public and how this has been threatened, corrupting the broad, critical self-assessment and data-based reflection that's necessary to make good decisions. So join us next time, and thank you.